Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
The 1950s in America, right? Prosperity boom time. A nation standing tall, champion of freedom on the world stage. And it's a big but for many African Americans, the reality was, well, totally different.
Yeah, it was.
We're going deep on this, on the systemic discrimination they face, the kind of stuff that set the stage for the civil rights movement.
Right.
Our guide for this deep dive is the Discrimination Against African Americans in the 1950s podcast. We're going beyond the textbook, folks, trying to understand the why. Why was this movement so urgent?
You know, it's interesting. People think of this period as like a straight shot to equality, but it's so much more complicated than that. The post-war years, you see both steps forward and backwards. It's this really complex backdrop for the fight for civil rights.
Yeah, a real push and pull. And one of the big things we got to unpack is de jure segregation. Basically, discrimination, like officially written into law. We're talking Jim Crow, right?
Exactly. And to really get Jim Crow, we got to go beyond just defining it. Picture a society where your race determines every single part of your life, the school you go to, even the water fountain you use. This wasn't just about separate places. It was about making one group permanently seem less than.
And this whole thing was built on that separate but equal idea, which we know is, well, misleading, to say the least.
Exactly. Separate rarely, if ever, actually means equal. I mean, look at Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, right? That decision, it upheld separate but equal, but all it really did was make decades of inequality official. And the proof is everywhere when you compare what life was actually like for Black and white Americans back then.
Okay, so let's get specific. What were some of those day-to-day differences that really showed how different the ideal and reality were?
Well, look at education. Imagine you're a Black student in, say, the 1950s South. You're going to a school that's always short on funds, especially compared to the white school down the road. We're talking packed classrooms, old textbooks, teachers barely making a living compared to their white counterparts.
So basically, from day one, Black students are already behind, stuck in this cycle of inequality.
That's it. And this lack of good education impacts everything. Jobs, making a decent living. It's this terrible cycle that's almost impossible to escape. And tragically, it wasn't just education. This deliberate holding back, it happened with voting rights, too, a basic right in any democracy.
It's crazy how blatant the attempts were to stop African Americans from voting.
It's messed up, right? The 15th Amendment, 1870, gives Black men the vote. But then Southern states come up with all these ways to get around it. Literacy tests that were impossible to pass, poll taxes most people couldn't afford, and these grandfather clauses that just happened to let most white voters off the hook. This wasn't by accident. These were deliberate ways to keep Black people from voting.
And it wasn't just legal loopholes either. The podcast also talks about the atmosphere of fear they created to keep African Americans from even thinking about voting.
Oh, absolutely. There's a story about Reuben Stacy. He was lynched in 1933 just for trying to register to vote. And remember, lynching, it wasn't just murder. It was a message done in public to scare the entire community into silence.
It's a scary reminder of how strong those in power were and how far they would go, and the numbers back it up. In 1952 Mississippi, only 5% of Black folks who were eligible were actually registered to vote.
It just shows you the huge gap between what democracy is supposed to be and what it actually was for African Americans. And it wasn't just in the South either. Discrimination was all over the country, just in different forms.
Right, Jim Crow might have been mostly in the South, but Black people up north faced their own barriers. Housing discrimination, fewer job opportunities, even some labor unions were hostile.
And here's the worst part. Even programs that seemed like they were trying to help, like the GI Bill after World War II, ended up hurting Black veterans.
Yeah, that bill was supposed to help veterans get back on their feet, right? Education, home loans, you think it'd be huge for everyone. What happened?
Well, there was so much discrimination in banks, colleges, and housing. It created huge roadblocks for Black veterans. Historian Ira Kasnelson talks about this, how they were denied loans, kept out of universities, and pushed away from white neighborhoods. Basically, they were robbed of the opportunities that white veterans got without a problem.
It's like they were trying to climb this ladder of opportunity and someone kept yanking it away. Just another way the system was rigged against them.
It's just heartbreaking, It wasn't enough to make Black people second-class citizens on paper. They had to live with this constant threat of violence, too.
You're talking about groups like the Klan, those white citizens' councils. They were more than just hateful, weren't they?
Right, they were the muscle behind this whole racist system. They used intimidation, beatings, even murder to keep Black people afraid. If you dared to question things, even a little, there were serious consequences.
The podcast really drives that home with the story of Emmett Till. 14 years old, just a kid, murdered in 1955, supposedly for whistling at a white woman.
Emmett Till's case is so important because it woke up the whole country. He was just a boy visiting from Chicago, and the brutality of it, the fact that his killers were acquitted by an all-white jury, it sparked outrage and really fueled the growing civil rights movement.
And his mother, Mamie Till, her courage is unbelievable. She insisted on an open casket at his funeral, wanted everyone to see what they did to her son.
It's hard to imagine the strength it took to share her grief like that, to force people to confront that hate. That was a turning point in itself.
So not only were they facing this constant threat of violence, the podcast also talks about how they used economic retaliation to silence people too.
Oh yeah, imagine knowing that if you spoke up against segregation, you could lose your job, your home, everything. It was a way of using economic fear to trap people in a system they hated.
Makes you realize how incredibly brave those were who did speak out, knowing they were risking it all.
Absolutely. And it's in these incredibly tough times that we see how powerful art can be. The podcast talks about this Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit, about lynching in the South.
Oh, that song still sends chills down my spine. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Just incredibly powerful and disturbing.
Strange Fruit wasn't just a song. It was a powerful statement about racial terror. A lot of radio stations refused to play it, but its message got through. It forced people to face this horrible reality that many wanted to ignore.
It shows how art can be like a mirror, reflecting the ugliest parts of society and giving a voice to those things we don't want to talk about. It's a lot to take in, you know? Look at what it was like for African Americans in the 1950s.
It really is.
It'd be easy to just feel despair, but there's this whole other side to it, this story of incredible strength and resistance.
You're so right. The podcast shows us this awful chapter in American history, but it also shows the spirit of the people fighting for something better. It reminds you of the power of hope, even when things seem so unfair.
We've covered a lot of heavy stuff in this deep dive. Jim Crow, people kept from voting, the lack of economic opportunities, and that constant threat of violence. It feels pretty overwhelming, honestly.
And the most important thing to remember is how connected all these injustices are. It wasn't just random bad things happening. It was a whole system built to maintain white supremacy, to deny African Americans their basic rights.
And like you were saying, it was made even stronger by economic hardship and that fear of violence. But even in the middle of all that, the seeds of change were being planted.
Exactly. The podcast host makes a good point. The 1950s weren't just about struggle. They were about the beginning of organized resistance. You see the early civil rights movement started to take shape, the NAACP fighting segregation in court, those brave individuals standing up to unjust laws, registering to vote even though it was dangerous.
Makes you think, with everything so stacked against them, what was the turning point? What made everyone finally demand change?
That's the big question, right? Was it the Supreme Court decisions that started to dismantle segregation? Was it the bravery of people like Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, starting a movement that caught the world's attention?
Or was it more like a million little acts of courage all adding up? The tireless work of all those civil rights groups, people like Billie Holiday singing about things no one wanted to hear, everyday people putting everything on the line for a chance at equality.
It was probably all of it, don't you think? Every act of resistance, every voice speaking out against injustice, it all built up to this collective awakening. And that's what's so powerful about this time in history. It shows that even when things seem impossible to change, change can happen.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in making a fairer world. And that fight doesn't end with one victory or a new law. It takes constant work, always being ready to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
That's it, exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. What can we do right now to be part of that fight for equality and justice? How can we make sure that all those sacrifices back then weren't for nothing?
It's something we all need to ask ourselves. This has been an amazing conversation, really eye-opening. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and let's keep working for a better future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.